Today we're talking about my favorite Britney Spears song, Toxic Blade. That item got buffed in patch 5.13, and the buff was not exactly one to write home about if you look at it just by itself. The attack speed of the item got increased by 10%. I thought this was really interesting though, because I recently looked at Toxic Blade in the context of another comparison, which was the one for Hastened Katana. I figured it would be easy enough to simply take the numbers and values already calculated in that video a while back and use them here for this particular buff to see how things have changed for this item. As a reminder on the stats of Toxic Blade, it has plus 100 health, plus 15 penetration, plus now 30% attack speed, previously 20%, plus 10% movement speed, and the passive is enemies hit by your basic attacks gain 20% reduced healing, stacking up to 2 times and lasting 8 seconds. And just while making this video, I found out how good that really is. Because I thought, it's the typical 40% reduction, so it's just gonna work like brawlers and that's it, and it's just not gonna stack or anything, but it actually does stack. You can be affected by Toxic Blade and Brawler's Beatstick at the same time, reducing your healing by up to 80%. I don't think I really need to explain to you how good that is. You basically take away almost all of a character's healing with that. And this is something that one character can build on their own. For hybrid characters, for basic attack focused characters that can still make use of abilities, this is very much possible. Often in a late game build you can still implement a secondary power focused item of some sort, and that could be Brawler's Beatstick. Even though it's not the ideal one for DPS, that goes for Toxic Blade as well, and that's what we're going to look into here specifically, how much of a sacrifice you're still making by buying Toxic Blade. In earlier times it was still a fairly significant DPS drop-off compared to other items, and that was one of the major downsides. Whereas now I would feel like it's getting much closer to Brawler's Beatstick and Divine Ruin, which are both very strong items. There is very little reason not to build them if there's any healing on the enemy team, unless you have some specific build strategy you're going for, as they are stat-wise so efficient that they basically go almost in line with any other item. For example, in a scenario of Brawler's Beatstick versus Crusher, with Crusher you will probably come out ahead a little bit DPS-wise overall due to the mix of stats and due to the damaging passive. But against a healing target that looks different, as while you would still do more damage with Crusher, you would not be able to do anything against the healing, and the healing would probably out-heal the extra damage that you're getting from Crusher. With Brawlers, you would effectively shut down a lot of that healing, and as such, in the end have lowered the health bar by a healing enemy a little bit more, as they heal against it less. While it can be debated if counter items should still be so strong and efficient at the same time, because I really don't think they necessarily have to, I think it's the same path that Hi-Rez wants to go with Toxic Blade for now at least, and we're gonna look at if they have achieved that. And for that, we on one hand have the stats, and on the other hand we have the experience that I have from playing with this item. Now stat-wise, I want to pull up this table that I talked about before, where we can see different items and their DPS overall and what they provide in regards to different stats. We had Hastened Katana as a pretty good benchmark here, so to speak, with 25 power and 0.25 attack speed for 2200 gold, which results in a 134.5 DPS, and this also has 10% movement speed and it has haste on top of that too. So it's in many ways actually somewhat similar to Toxic Blade, though obviously you don't want to miss out on the haste passive, at least on a more movement focused character like for example Kali. So this is something you'd still prioritize and you would build before, especially because in early game the tier 1 and tier 2 items of Toxic Blade are not the best to increase your clear. They only have health and movement speed, which doesn't effectively bring your clear early. It doesn't bring much else to the table unless you're all about faster rotations. But overall, the items you're looking for here are those that have a little bit of power, a little bit of attack speed on the lower tiers to help you clear as well. And that is something that Hastened Katana, for example, offers, that your boots offer too from tier 2 on. That's why Ninja Tabi would be the next one here. Obviously something you want to always build anyways, but in theory, in DPS, if we had it here in this place, we'd end up at 134.6 DPS. This, by the way, is on a Bakasura level 10 with Assassin's Blessing and Power Boots. So we have the Power Boots calculation, and hypothetically Ninja Tabi would have this output even though we can't build it here. There's also Atalanta's Bow, which is a story of its own, which comes in at higher DPS with 144.9, but at the same time, it's pretty much all it's about because it has that movement speed buff and doesn't really provide anything else like the other items do. RC, also not really worth talking about that much here, 116.5, and that already brings us to Toxic Blade. You could theoretically include Aquatic as well, which is always annoying for damage calculations, which is why I left this out, which would also end up with higher DPS due to the power steal, especially on later shots, something always worth keeping in mind, and something which in situations where the enemy doesn't have healing would most certainly result in higher DPS, but that's not what we're purely about here. And now we have Toxic Blade. And Toxic Blade has 100 health. That's something you won't see reflected in any of these stats because it doesn't have any effect on the damage output against a target with protections, but all the other stats do, and the movement speed is just because it will also be utilized in combat. But it's worth pointing out you have these 100 extra HP, which can be useful sometimes, give you a little bit more survivability. So with Toxic Blade, the old version gave us 117.2 DPS. That puts it pretty much at the end of the spectrum of attack speed pen power items, being right there with RC with this 116.5. The new version, however, gets a fair bit of a bump. We're now at 125.9 DPS. This brings it pretty much to the point where Ninja Tabe would be if you could build it, which obviously is still a fair bit cheaper, but that's just what it is with boots. I told you many times that they are incredibly cost efficient for what they offer. It's not incredibly far away from Hasten Katana, less than 10 DPS difference, which when the enemy is healing definitely will be very, very noticeable. You also obviously always have to factor in that Crusher exists, and again, Crusher is just damage-wise the best option you can get, even without the extra added benefit from the passive. It comes in at 152.4 DPS. But what you also have to keep in mind is that Toxic Blade is one of the few items here among with Atalanta's Bow that has 0.3 attack speed. And 0.3 attack speed, with it being more rare, is something that also benefits other things. Not only obviously do you stack Toxic Blade itself faster, but you also stack other stacking items like Stonecutting Sword or Executioner faster, and you also get more procs of things like Kin Size. Anything that's on hit, any on hit effect, will proc more often. The DPS potential that is created through that should not be understated and probably even outweighs something like the Crusher. But the item doesn't stop there. It's something that's been toyed around with in the past, and it's more than ever a very viable idea now, building it on magical ADCs, especially on Freya. Magical ADCs have a relatively hard time coming by attack speed, and with Toxic Blade being accessible to them, it now got a whole lot better for some early attack speed or mid-game attack speed spike, and it also provides you with that extra movement speed, which they really benefit from, especially now that there is no Hasten Katana for mages anymore, and sticking to enemies is a little bit harder in moments where you don't have Hasten Ring proccing for you. Even in a crit build, this can technically be implemented as well, as again, it will increase your chance to get proc on hits from crits like Poison Star, like Wind Demon, and basically make you snowball more afterwards. Though it's gonna be hard to fit this into a hunter build anyways. The reason being that it's simply still not fully geared to maximize DPS compared to items like Aquatic, and as such, you will, always make a little bit of a sacrifice for it, and the sacrifice still, as it has some stats that are not as beneficial for hunters with health and movement speed, feel a little bit bigger than the ones of Brawler's Speedstick. That said, with hunters opting into a more defensive choice sometimes and some teams really stacking up healing at the moment, this doesn't seem like an option that's completely out of the picture entirely and should at least be considered by at least one character per team when it seems necessary. And that can't always be the jungler because sometimes the jungler is just not basic attack focused enough for it. I definitely think that the item is a lot more viable now and should be more considered a situational, very possible item, not necessarily a core item, but not so much of an outlier item as well. And the synergy with other anti-healing should be very, very strong. And I could imagine that actually leading to a nerf sooner or later, because really it's pretty scary. 80% reduction, and then you can probably drop a Pestilence on top of that as well, and nobody heals anymore. With that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. Also, if you haven't checked it out yet, Teets made a video very recently about Baron Samedi, made a little bit of a guide, so if you want to see that, I can highly recommend watching it. It's very well animated, so not only from an informational standpoint, but also a visual standpoint, it should be very pleasant. And that's enough promotion, at least for Teets' channel. You can obviously subscribe to mine here as well, if you like to see more content like this. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.